All right, hey guys, we're back for part two. So I'm going to go ahead and disappear again. So we got as far as last time talking about calendaring and continuance of our case and how it would be handled differently at the state system versus the federal system. And so I told you briefly about how my experience is in terms of cases and calendaring. In other words, it's been scheduled for a particular court and whether or not it actually goes or doesn't go. Um, my experience has been that state courts tend to have more continuances or delays than federal courts, and I have testified in both. Um, and again, in part, just as a quick review, typically in the federal system, a judge will have a case from beginning to end, so he or she becomes very familiar with the case, and so is generally trying to be on top of the case to get a process in a timely manner. Um, and state courts, because of the way state courts are structured, different judges might play a different role in a case, felony cases. And I think my last reference was, for example, preliminary hearings are often heard in courts of limited jurisdiction. And then once that court determines that there's sufficient probable cause to hold someone over for trial, then the defendant next has to go to a court of general jurisdiction um, for his felony case. So, in terms of that process, that's just my experience. Um, you, depending on your occupation or impact or role in the court system, might have a different experience, but that's just mine. All right. So, this talks about continuance. So, we do have a continuation policy, a continuance policy that we'll talk about here in a minute. So, again, tie some of these things as you defend your response. All right, those are the things that are going to be critical. Don't make this any harder than it is. It's basically describe how calendaring teams of this scenario might be handled differently, and I've given you some tips, and then defend your response. Okay, so hopefully that helps. Next is identify the key role within the federal and state judicial system that most impacts process. And how does this role aid in creating and maintaining an efficient, effective judicial system? And this really just goes back to that paper you guys just wrote in Module 4. All right, so go back to that paper. What key role did you write about within the federal and state judicial systems, and how does it impact process? So what does this person do in terms of moving a case along in an efficient and effective manner? Are they somehow involved in the court scheduling of cases, assigning docket numbers, or whatever the case may be? It could be a court clerk. You could be writing about the role of an attorney. You could be writing about the role of a judge. All of these are key roles within the court process. So, try not to recreate the wheel, so to speak. I would just go back to that particular paper you wrote last week and figure out how that can apply here. Okay. Next is determine the impact venue on the process of efficiency of the scenario, the venue response. So this gets back to our location of where the crime occurred, and our crime occurred in Washington, D.C., and our defendants were arrested in another state, which we do not know, but it's out of state. So there's a couple issues here that can impact the venue. Number one is, since our defendants were arrested out of state, we're going to have a process to get them back into Washington, D.C., so they can be arraigned on the charges of bank robbery. And so that may require an extrajudicial hearing in the state in which they were arrested, especially if they decide to fight some level of extradition back to Washington, D.C. And so that's going to be critical. We got to get our bank robbers back. So that could impact venue. The other thing that could impact venue is the fact that not only do we have to get our robbers back, whatever physical evidence we have needs to be returned to the court of jurisdiction so we can be prepared for trial. Lastly is we have witnesses not only in Washington, D.C., but we also have witnesses that are in the other state. And so we're going to have to make sure that those witnesses appear in court. And that can present some problems, especially in the calendaring of a case. So this one becomes very critical for the trial judge to make sure that things are on track and on schedule, because the last thing you want to do is to subpoena witnesses from out of state, have them drive all the way to Washington, D.C., however far that might be, and then be told, no, go home because the judge is sick or because there's a conflict in the courtroom, whatever the case is. All right, so those kind of things can impact venue. And I'll give you a real life example that I had experience in terms of the impact of venue. When I was a detective, I was assigned to robberies, and one of the cases I was assigned was a bank robbery. And so I worked in conjunction with the FBI. And typically, as local police, we tend to have more of understanding as to who's who in town and have our set of informants. And so eventually we were able to develop a suspect in the case. And long story short, my case was one of several cases that this guy had committed his series of bank robberies. And so the assistant U.S. attorney decided to pick the 3 top cases, in other words, cases that she thought she had the strongest evidence based on physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. And my case was one of them. Being from Southern California, I'm located in the Central District of California. All right, so I'm in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. And at that time, all the Central District courts were pretty much located in downtown Los Angeles. So for me, that was a commute of about 35 miles, which may not seem like much, but we're talking about Southern California. So getting on the freeway to go to Los Angeles at 8 o'clock in the morning could take you 2 hours to get there. So the impact to me in terms of venue was, I really needed to make sure that when I was called to go to court that I'm going to testify, because the last thing I wanted to do was go to downtown Los Angeles, spend 2 hours driving to get there, and wait around all day, and then be told to come back tomorrow and probably take me longer to get home. And so that's a reality in terms of venue. So in our case, we're talking about federal courts, and most federal courts tend to be located in large urban centers. And so if you live in the outskirts of a large urban center, maybe 30 miles out or 40 miles out, but you're still in the jurisdiction of that federal court district, then you as a witness may have to travel 40, 50 miles to go to court. So it's very important that in terms of venue, that the calendar of the case is correct, that the trial is moving as the judge anticipates, along with the attorneys, so that when witnesses are called, they are called in, their testimony is taken, and they're dismissed. Again, like I said, in state courts, I've had times where I've been called to appear either to testify in terms of a motion to dismiss or the motion to squash some level of evidence or some other type of judicial hearing, and been told to come back the next day or it's going to be scheduled. Obviously, during a trial, that's generally not going to happen because things are a little bit more structured during the trial and lawyers have an idea as to when you're going to be needed. But there's a lot of other court processes that take place that police officers have to attend. So that's a pretty good example from me in terms of how cases venue can impact you and process on efficiency. And then again, just to highlight what I mentioned about our particular case and our location and having to bring witnesses in from another state in order to testify. So the court really has to have its act together so that these people can get in the court, testify, and then go home. So you can take a look at that in terms of the impact of venue. So hopefully you can use some of the information that I provided. Okay. Finally, it's explained how a 4-month continuous affects the efficiency of a court under the circumstances presented in the scenario to defend your response. And this goes back to the continuation policy, and I'll go over that here in just a second. But you're going to have to look at this continuance. 4 months may be too long, but allowing a continuance for attorneys to determine the strength or weaknesses of the government case probably is not all that unusual. especially in this case, we're dealing with multiple defendants, so we got 3 defendants and probably three attorneys, so that can add a little bit more to the problem here. The thing I just want to leave you with real quick on this is that everyone is entitled to a speedy trial, right? Okay, but also remember that a speedy trial doesn't always mean a fair trial. So as a judge is going to have to balance the need for judicial efficiency, a speedy trial, but at the same time balance that with the constitutional right to a fair trial, and that the defendant has got to be able to have lawyers that are well prepared in order to prepare a defense for them, or at least gather enough information that maybe evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the government's case, and if the government has a strong case, then maybe plea bargains in order. So take a look at this one in terms of continuance and whether or not you think 4 months is too long. Take a look at the continuance policy. That'll give you some guidelines, and that'll help you in your analysis and trying to defend your response to this particular question. Okay? So that is it for this part. So again, you're going to have to deal with calendaring and docketing. So take a look at the resources, review my lecture notes, and then how calendaring and continuance in this case might be handled at the federal and state level. The key role, and again, I would just tie that back to that paper you just wrote. The impact of venue, I've given you some ideas, especially as it relates to our scenario, and whether or not you think a continuance is in order and how that could impact the court's efficiency, right? Realize that anytime there's a continuance, there's always going to be a domino effect, because eventually that case has got to come back to court, and so now you got to squeeze it in with some other cases that the court's also dealing with. So there is an impact to a continuance, but sometimes it may be efficient because maybe it yields a plea bargain, and sometimes it might be inefficient in that things tend to drag on a little bit more than they anticipate. All right, I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to go real quick to a power slide presentation just to cover some of these processes and techniques that are associated with this week's assignment. So hold on one sec. Okay, we are back. So let's just real quick go over the processes and techniques that are described in some of the articles that are associated with this week's assignment. So first thing, steps to ensure firm trial dates, because those are going to be important. Having trial dates clearly established so that everybody's ready, on time, and prepared, so we can move the case through the judicial system and reach a verdict. So some of the things that you can do, and these are from the resources for your readings for this week, is maximize dispositions before setting specific trial dates. And basically what this means is the court should seek opportunities to dispose of cases before they are put on the court's calendar list. In other words, try to deal with them before we decide we're going to go to trial. And there's a series of steps that take place, obviously, before a person gets after a person gets arrested and arraigned, and then before we go to trial. There's a myriad of steps that takes place, and again, federal judges tend to be more actively involved in trying to seek resolution of cases only because they have the case from beginning to end, so they become very familiar with the processes of the case. So that's important. Set realistic calendar setting levels so that you can have a reasonable but firm policy limiting the grant of continuances. Next is establish a continuance policy for assuring credible trial dates. That's going to be important. And in some cases, having a backup judge capacity. In other words, if the judge is out, for example, is there another judge that we can use to hear the legal issues associated with that case so we can move it forward and keep the case moving, all right? Next this is time standards for cases by the American Bar Association. So you could take a look at this. So felony cases typically, ideally, 90% of the cases should be resolved within 120 days. 98% of the cases should be resolved in 180 days. And 100% of the cases should be resolved in 365 days. So again, we're talking about your typical run-of-the-mill felony cases. Murder cases and other type of extenuating felony cases might not be done in a year. But typically, there's no reason why, for example, our bank robbery case can't be done within a window of 1 year. right? So that's just an idea. So this is also from your readings. And finally, just take a look at these